So we're going to get started. I'm going to call up the first panel, which will be moderated by Katie Swenson. Katie is the Vice President of Design and Sustainability at Enterprise Community Partners. Her work investigates how critical design practice can and should promote economic and social equity, environmental sustainability, and healthy communities. She co-authored the book Growing Urban Habitats. She's on the board of Mass Design Group and winner of the 2017 Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Architecture. Beyond the official bio, Katie is what I like to call a force of nature. She is a person with incredible energy, with incredible optimism, with incredible desire to make things happen. And when she comes into your sphere, you get swept along into that orbit. She's been a good friend of the Joint Center, as Enterprise Community Partners has been, and helped to pull us in this direction. So we're really delighted to have Katie today here with us to help moderate this first panel.
I walked into Chris's office about maybe 18 months ago and said, I think it's time that we do some design and policy research. Kind of looked at me and said, I don't even know what that would mean. Well, you may have met on the way in Donald Taylor Patterson, who's sitting outside, who, with our partnership from the Joint Center, just finished our first policy paper, investigating on how design is or is not incentivized in the qualified allocation plan in Massachusetts. So on the way in, I saw one of my colleagues and we were chatting, and he works throughout the state of Massachusetts, and we said, well, let's get together and get a bigger agenda together to deliver to the Joint Center. So Chris, we're not done yet. We're just getting started, and excited to build out these more strategic ways for design, essentially, to infiltrate the housing delivery system and kind of make a much larger impact. At Enterprise Community Partners, the kind of statistics that really keep us up at night are, of course, 20 million Americans who are housing insecure, 500,000 people who are without homes, living outside on average every night. But I also wonder, sometimes in the housing space, these kind of numbers and our language gets a little bit in the way, I would say. I was recently visiting with an architect activist and a woman who was formerly homeless. She spent about 6 years living in the Skid Row neighborhood. She's now in a beautiful, small apartment on Main Street that is subsidized. And at lunch, we talked about using the word homeless, a word that they choose not to use. For them, and I think for all of us, the notion of home is so deeply tied to our identity and our sort of sense of self. So that when we call people homeless or we refer to a homeless problem, sometimes this even happens when we talk about housing or affordable housing. We tend to sort of distance, I would say, the person and the problem from their sort of core humanity. I was in Atlanta recently, where the city of Atlanta is undertaking a real effort to bring design excellence into their affordable housing program. And of course, you know there, Martin Luther King's notion of the beloved community says essentially that homelessness and poverty will not be tolerated. So I think the first thing that we have to do is fundamentally set our intentions in a slightly different way, to sort of recognize the humanity behind these statistics and to get to work on providing real solutions that not only elevate the quantity of housing, but absolutely elevate the quality. And Chris, I think we have to have a larger discussion today about what constitutes quality and how do we know it when we see it. So the Joint Center is asking us an important and pressing question here today to the design community in particular at this moment. Can we fundamentally change the economics of housing production so that we can increase, that we can achieve these outcomes, but at a dramatically lower price? I took a little issue when David called me about lowering the cost of housing panel. Enterprise has done so much work on this. I would absolutely encourage you to go read our Bending the Cost Curve report, which really does a great job of spelling out these issues. And he said, no, we don't want to just chomp around the edges. We actually want to see if there's a way to fundamentally change the economics of housing production. I said, I'm in. I'm absolutely in. So our panelists today are going to share perspectives from very different parts of the country. We're going to start with Brian Phillips, who's here from Philadelphia. Philadelphia, I believe, is a relatively affordable place to live right now and a relatively affordable place to build. Then we're going to turn to Michael Thomas, who's here from the Bay Area, one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. And then we're going to go to Andrew Freear, who's here doing his year as a Loeb Fellow and hailing from Alabama, where, of course, the economics of housing production are completely different. So I'm going to welcome our panelists, and I've asked them a few questions that they'll address and we'll kind of carry on throughout the day. What is the role of designers in the production of housing? Designers seem to often be in limited roles according to sort of a constraint in the timeline in which they're engaged or the parameters of their contract. Second, are there ways to engage designer skills more broadly and in a more timely fashion that could yield a bigger impact on costs? Can designers create value while reducing total development costs? And then lastly, third, we should consider the definition of home and whether that definition is evolving and how. As a society, and as a design community, how do we understand what are the kind of new modes of living, new modes of housing products? Can we conceptualize something socially and culturally both specific, but perhaps different? What are these new models and how are they evolving so that we can create new typologies that will dramatically reduce the cost of design and construction? So I'm going to first welcome Brian Phillips to the stage. Thank you.
Hey guys, great to be here. So I think, architects usually get up and running after 10 minutes, and I actually have to be done in less than 10 minutes. So I'm going to jump right in. I am going to use my time to try to talk a little bit about the way an architect using the skills of design can engage with some of these issues. We're not really activists or policymakers, though we're aware of these issues, but we really are focused on how can our day-to-day work with our clients result in what we like to think of as working around the edges and margins of projects to make them better. Do I know where the advance is here? Yes. I think this is both, I think, a story about practice, but also a story about Philadelphia. Katie had mentioned that it's an affordable city, and I think in a way, the laboratory of Philadelphia has taught us some lessons, which we're now trying to export to other cities, and I think might be a fun thing to talk about once we get to the panel. But these are the things that we spend time thinking about as designers. It's not so much making low-cost housing look great, which we think is a foregone conclusion, a good place to live, but we start engaging with the parameters of development, land acquisition, zoning codes, building codes, pro formas. We like to know all that information and use design thinking to engage with those issues. So I'm going to just share a series of case studies that hopefully will reflect this. This project actually is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. It's called 100K House. A developer came to us and said, let's build 1,000 square foot, $100 a square foot LEED Platinum infill houses for Philadelphia. You can see how this was sort of on the edge when it was built. It is now largely built out, but that charge to a lot of architects would be kind of a nightmare. Like, of course we can't do that. Why would we even want to? You need to spend more money on good housing. But the result for us was to almost act more like industrial designers, or to act more like a kind of number crunching team of like, how do we spend money on a house that's going to realize this market. This is less than the zoning code allowed. This was really about starter homes for young millennials moving to Philadelphia. Super energy efficient, which isn't going to be the point of my talk, but one of the things I just want to point out is this house had two doors, the bathroom door and the front door. And so this whole idea about are there new ways of thinking about housing that are small and simple that can control costs and frankly also create spaces that people want to live in. We really thought of these as urban cabins. You see the exposed concrete floor, some of the plywood finishes, very off-the-shelf pieces coming together to create these little houses. And you know, even we gave ourselves the parameter of 4 corners flat facades because we knew that would be very energy efficient and it'd be very cost effective. So we wound up printing on these like a t-shirt as a way to sort of create the kind of identity of the facade. And then we started to realize that Philadelphia is a funny town. It's got 440,000 row houses. No other city in America quite stacks up like this. Baltimore is sort of similar. There's this democracy of the grid where whether you're rich or poor, you probably live in a 16-foot wide house, which creates this common sort of challenge for living. And I think we're finding ways to exploit this. So I'm going to take you through 3 different quick projects that talk about 3 different ways that we operate in this fabric. Just real quickly, Philadelphia lost a lot of population since 1950. It's on the rebound, resulted in a lot of vacant land. So that's part of what we're now working on. And one of the things we do is we infill single lots. This was a funny project. Our project's in the middle, the white one. When this developer came to us, they were worried that the market wouldn't be mature enough to sell houses. And by the time we broke ground, there were houses all around us getting built. We'll talk about why that's happening so fast. But one of the things we learned here was this idea that the outside of the house didn't have to be expensive. And in fact, on a row house block, the sidewalk in the street is actually the living room, and that this arms race for facade curb appeal on a lot of projects we're seeing is almost a misplaced investment. And so our idea with this was about core appeal, which was put the value of the house inside. And for basically the price, actually a little under what a lot of people are building these starter homes for in this neighborhood, people are able to live in what feels like a very sort of generous space where the value is in the kitchen, and the bathrooms and the stairway, which is the stuff you touch as you live in the house. So just rethinking the way we're spending the money was a sort of lesson here. The vacancy of Philadelphia sometimes results in big pieces that are missing. And this next project resulted from the demolition of an outmoded school. You can see here on the top left, basically the diagram was to continue the row house fabric. Sort of parking in the middle of the block. That was all turf paved, so it's also an outdoor recreation space. But one of the things we've been using, if you think about this as 100K growing up as far as scale, this is a combination of condo flats, 3-story and 2-story houses. The 2-story houses sold in the upper 200s, which in this market was a pretty remarkable number. Still hitting about that $100 a square foot. You can see the simplicity of and I apologize for the sort of slightly blown out floor plans there with the contrast, but very simple cores, very simple interior layouts, and really hitting a kind of green performance level that is also putting some money back in people's pockets instead of to the utility company. We're also very interested in local things. We are very inspired by understanding how housing projects fit into neighborhoods. And this was such a fun thing to do in South Philadelphia, the home of the Mummers. I don't know if you guys know about these guys. They're on the top. But this developer was really struck. He was very worried about the cyan-colored facade, saying this was going to stick out in a funny way. And we said, no, trust us. It's South Philly. You'll never see it. And I think in a way it's kind of true. It was like, you know, it actually created a kind of sort of animation and sort of the way that the existing houses do, and the neighbors were extremely sort of embracing of it. And you can see just interiors again. This is a little bit more grown up than the original 100K, but still lots of off the shelf, very sort of simple, you know, deployment of materials and design. So this is my favorite category, the leftover category, and this is what happens as a market matures and all of the easy sites are gone. And now developers start turning back to what are the sites that are hard to develop. And I think this is a lesson we've been learning about how maybe the architect can unlock interesting value. So this was a 20 by 100 foot lot under the elevated train, which I would say it's a corridor that 3 or 4 years ago was not a place most Philadelphians wanted to be after midnight. And the developer came to us and said, it's right on the train. I'm really worried about whether people are going to want to live here. And we really embrace this idea that if you're going to live on the train, you need to really live on the train. So you can kind of see diagrammatically, these apartments fit into a very narrow site with terraces that face the train. This filled up very quickly, and while they were affordable, they were also very desirable. And just to talk a little bit about some of the tactics, the zoning code was kind of funny. It sort of had a mean roof height, which you're seeing in that diagram there at the bottom, but also a required cornice line to relate to some of the other buildings. So the shape of the building really came out of the maximum build-out envelope and sort of traced the diagram of what was allowed. You can see on the left in the plans, there's a single stair in the middle of the building with flanking units facing front and back. And here you can kind of see the relationship to the train. And you can also see on that upper level, there are these sort of volume spaces that allow people to experience the roof line that is interesting and dynamic. And you can see the sort of terraces that are revealed. That's one on the back. You can see what it's like to be out front there looking at the train go by. And we've now done a series of projects along the train that are frankly being built on pieces of land that are still affordable and finding ways to maximize the number of apartments and places to live on those lots. And not to make them feel marginalized, but frankly, this corridor, we do have a habit of gentrifying corridors a bit in the sense that lots of people want to live on this corridor. This is my favorite leftover right now that's under construction, which was a site that when the developer first mentioned it, we couldn't find because it was 11 feet wide. And was essentially 2 nose-in parking spaces. We're building 7 apartment units on this site, and you can see on the left the kind of section of how we're doing this. And this is not New York, obviously, because this is a wood frame building that has a couple of steel moment frames in it, but is being done with very off-the-shelf construction and very everyday contractors. And again, it's a little bit like that last project I showed with that stair in the center and some flanking units. It's actually a 3-story building that's 70 feet tall, and you get these double height sort of living spaces that actually feel a lot more spacious than you might imagine. I want to make 3 points about why I think Philadelphia is generating these projects. One of them is this idea of small batch development. I think one of the things we're going to hear about today is volume is important. And I think that's true. A lot of cities are tens of thousands of units behind on affordability. But one of the things we're seeing is that small projects, both of these projects, the banker, the lawyer, the developer are all sitting at the table and everybody gets on board with the project we're doing. And the financing, there's not distance from the project on things like financing and some of the regulation, that everybody sort of gets on board, and I think that allows for some interesting risk. We've also become really interesting in this idea of what we're calling lab cities. It's interesting, we're working in Detroit and Chicago, and if you look at them statistically, they're sort of similar to Philadelphia. My last slide will sort of point this out, but I don't think cities sit in the lab zone forever. But I think when they're in the lab zone, it means they're just affordable enough. And we think that's a place where there can be innovation. And we're now looking for other cities where we can contribute to the way that they're unfolding. I just saw the stop sign. I'm on my last slide. For the sake of data, and this was actually provided by a research firm in Philadelphia called eConsult, but we've found this very interesting. If I'll just sort of wrap by just explaining what these sort of fields are. So top, you see politics, approvals, and construction, right? So politics is that kind of red tape, approvals is the neighborhood process, and construction is cost. And what's really interesting is you can see Philadelphia is not necessarily the cheapest place to build, but projects get done really quickly. And our zoning code allows a lot of projects to happen as of right. And as we're working in Chicago and Detroit, we're also seeing that they sort of have similar kinds of profiles. So as sort of food for thought as we kind of talk in the afternoon, I think this is worth consideration. Thank you.
All right. That stop sign was scary. I'm going to definitely get through this. Let's see here. Forward. Got it. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Michael Thomas. I'm the Director of Business Development for Panoramic Interests. We have been building high-density urban infill housing in the San Francisco Bay Area for the past 28 years. The company was started by Patrick Kennedy in 1990 in Berkeley, California. It was at a time in Berkeley where the Wall Street Journal described its citizens as a place where the people were torn between the desire to overthrow the United States government and the quest for the perfect croissant. So it was a very hard place to build. We did prevail. We ended up building about a dozen buildings in Berkeley and in San Francisco. In fact, the one in the bottom left was the first building built in downtown Berkeley since President Nixon was in office. And it was also quoted in the local newspaper as being a Stalinist monstrosity and monument to civic corruption. But our development philosophy has always been the same: build market rate housing that is affordable by design. In Oakland today, we are in the process of entitling what is currently the largest process going through the planning department with one very controversial characteristic. It is 1,000 units with no parking spaces. So this will come as no surprise to the room. We have, in the Bay Area, added a little less than 700,000 jobs over the last 8 years. During that same stretch, we've added only 100,000 housing units. So there's this incredible shortfall of units, which leaves the, what we would call the regular civilians competing for housing with, highly paid engineers working for Google. Even the cartoon artists in town are recognizing the ridiculousness of the housing situation. On the left is how apartments have been used forever. 2 bedrooms, you get a couple roommates, a small family. Today, on the right, that's how they're being used. My personal favorite is the bed in the bathtub or the sleeping loft in the kitchen. But cramming more people into less space has been the market's response to affordability. Our solution and response is as follows. For us to continue to build housing that is affordable by design, it needs these 3 things. The first one is building with no parking. Second, building with micro DNA. And by that, I don't mean building teeny tiny studios, but having apartments that have the spirit of small. And third, having a standardized set of designs which can be adapted to be modular. Next week, we are breaking ground on 200 units in San Francisco. We're going to have 650 residents, and we're going to have no parking spaces. The development immediately next door, similar in size, ended up building subterranean parking. We decided to build subterranean housing. It costs us about $60,000 per space to build a single parking space. By not building any parking, we were able to add 17% more housing for humans. I will say in San Francisco, it is no hardship not having a private car and a parking space. Most people that are moving to town are choosing not to have the headache of having a car. Certainly in the age of car share and bike share and scooter share, most people are choosing to not own the cow when they can just buy the milk. This is our second mantra, which is having what we call micro DNA. This is a project we built a couple years ago. It's 160 units. The one lesson that we learned, which was the greatest lesson, was that a 250 square foot studio was way too big. The favored units in this building ended up being our 3-bedroom suites. Those units were, they had the DNA and the spirit of a small studio, an efficient space, but we were able to have 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, a living room, a kitchen, all in less than 600 square feet. Now, for us, it's important to have just enough common space outside of the apartment. So always having a nice rooftop deck, having reading rooms in the building, having a cafe on the ground floor. But once we get past those basics, we stop. We don't do pools. We don't do gyms. We don't do doggy daycare in the buildings. In fact, in our office, we've banned the word amenity. We feel like the greatest amenity in San Francisco is price. This is a pretty good example of micro-DNA. On the left is a luxury studio built very close to our building on 10th Street. It's a studio that could have one person or a couple living in it, and it rents for about $3,500. In that same square footage, we've designed and are building 4-bedroom apartments. Now, this is the last and my personal favorite component that has to go into housing for us to keep it affordable. My favorite cheeseburger place in California happens to be In-N-Out Burger. Has anybody else in this room been to In-N-Out Burger? Oh my gosh, this is amazing. So for those that have, you can appreciate the simplicity of the menu. They have a hamburger, a cheeseburger, and a double-double. For us, it's the studio, the 2-bedroom, and the 4-bedroom. Now you can order off-menu at In-N-Out. We are not allowing off-menu ordering. We're sticking to those 3 designs. But having this standardized set of designs has allowed us to build modular. This was the first project that we built in 2013. It was our first modular project. Every unit was exactly the same as the next. We did not have a full catalog of various apartments. We ended up constructing the boxes up in Sacramento and then drove them down over the Bay Bridge in 16 pieces and stacked them up over the course of 4 days. So this saved us almost 8 months in construction time. Having that standardization has allowed us to create what we call the micropad. PAD stands for Prefab Affordable Dwelling. I actually have a little model of it here, which I'll leave on the table afterwards. It is uniformly 8 feet wide. We make these off-site, and then we bring them to the construction site on a traditional 18-wheeler, or it can come on a train or a boat. But using this construction technology is identical to the technology used in making shipping containers. Once they're brought to the site, they get stacked up just like Lego blocks. We can erect a 6-story building in less than a week. We did actually build a prototype of this. It is small. It's only 160 square feet, but we feel like it's very suited for single butchers or bakers or candlestick makers. We did recently submit a planning submittal to build our first micropad building in San Francisco. It's going to be a 5-story building and likely will be leased by a school. We do feel like, though, developments of this size, small developments that are using modular technology, are very well suited for building supportive housing for the homeless. And that's something we've been looking into a lot over the last 1.5 years. I don't know enough about Boston's homeless situation, but I will say in San Francisco it is at crisis level. By having a standardized design using modular technology, we feel that there is a potential to make a real material impact on homelessness. I think we really need to think big. Housing for every single homeless person in San Francisco and Berkeley could be delivered on this one boat with room to spare. The entire issue can be taken care of by this one single ship. I'm happy to be here today. Thanks for listening.
Hello? Okay. So you're trying to silence the rural interloper, huh? I got you. Okay. I'm Andrew Freear. This is where I live. It's Newbern in West Alabama, population of 178 folks, which is about half the size of this conference. I run Rural Studio, a small undergraduate architectural design and build program that's part of Auburn University. The program has operated in West Alabama for 25 years, and for my sins, I've been there for 18 years. With our community, we design and build homes, parks, and public facilities. At the tail end of the Appalachians, it's one of those rural areas with persistent poverty. Hale County has about 27% of folks living below the poverty line, and perhaps most shockingly, our neighboring county has childhood poverty of over 50%, Like the Delta and the Colonias, this part of the Appalachians has always had extraction industries. So a lot is taken away, but little is given back. Much of the land is owned by folks who don't live there. So when we try to raise taxes to support education, their powerful lobbyists frighten everyone into believing that even the smallest tax increase will be the end of the world. So, same with food. We grow and raise America's food, but we don't have access to good local food. This is just one of the causes of an increasingly troubling health situation. I was in Newbern this last week, and I took this screenshot of my expensive single-source satellite internet service, which other folks can't afford, right? I'm privileged as a professor that I can afford that. And I'm proud to say that my service was 1,140.6% slower than you folks get every day, right? So how can 60 million rural Americans participate in the economy if they can't connect to it? So for the studio, housing is a Trojan horse for a whole lot of issues. Jobs being number one. If you don't have a job, you can't own a home, and you can't stay in your community. The type of job is also important. There's a need, we need more than poverty-level service sector jobs. So 13 years ago, we started to look at a small site-built home. We imagined it being dignified, beautiful, and affordable, whilst encouraging folks to live within their means. The main goal was raising the quality of rural housing and offering an equitable product, and at the same time, and most importantly, it's locally built. So the money and the jobs stay in the local economy. This is a fun issue because 8 years ago, Metropolis actually suggested that we alone had figured out affordable housing, if you note that down at the bottom. So we haven't, and you haven't, right? The 20K house name, which though slightly naive, was originally based on getting access to the USDA Rural Development Direct Home Loan Grant, was also what we understood that anyone and everybody could afford, even on poverty-level incomes. Which amounts to about $100. So this is not 30%, because really poor folks certainly can't afford 30% of their income. But $100 a month out of your monthly burn could go into rent or mortgage. And that mortgage we suggested would be $20,000 over a 30-year ticket, right? We then divided that number roughly in half, but focused on materials as a thing that we could control. When I came to Alabama 20 years ago, this was affordable rural housing, the stereotypical condition of shacks with dirt floors. Today, there is still a serious problem of substandard housing. But I would argue the situation is actually even worse. Today, the landscape is also littered with second-hand trailers, the hermetically sealed, antisocial tin can where folks exist in 2 seasons of heating and cooling. The occupants are also trapped in the associated financial system that is the trailer home. The attraction, of course, is the trailer can be viewed and purchased one day and brought to the site the next. That's tough for us architects and builders to compete against. But it's also a product that deteriorates rapidly, is financed in a similar manner to a car, and is often misunderstood as real property. In most cases, it's not the first step on the road to home ownership and the American dream. So our goal is a home built in 3 to 4 weeks by 3 to 4 guys with a GC and a pickup truck and no crane. If you do that and you can just serve the single-person households that are in need of a home in Hale County, you can have an extraordinary impact. $16 million in a county of 16,000 people is a big deal, right? So we've done some 22 prototypes and put over 200,000 man-hours into the project over the last 13 years. We've progressed from 1 to 2 beds, building 1 to 2 prototypes a year. We have 3 models of the 1-bedroom that we like and that we see as a potential product line that we would like to roll out in the future. All are around 16K in materials. Now, without it being the aim, the 3 models have ended up as rural prototypes. Sorry, I can't read writing. And honestly, it's 16,000. Sorry. Okay, I'll go to the next one. So this is Dave's. Dave's is a shotgun, and they've ended up as looking at as being rural typologies simply because that's what the most efficient use of putting those $16,000 piles of sticks put together. It's what it looks like, frankly. So Dave's is a shotgun. Our houses mostly have single-form gable roofs to throw the water away from the foundations. And being small footprints, we can't justify turning the corner or adding appendages that may compromise the roof in the long term. The roof sits on top of a vented attic that shelters the insulated box. They're engineered to 110 mile-an-hour wind and raised off the ground to make for little site work as possible. We believe in porches for encouraging healthy living, and we try to make details and assemblies that are as simple to build and offer enough tolerance that even for the most inexperienced builder. We use zoned areas for ease of heating and cooling to attempt to control utility bills. And our challenge is 5 windows and 2 doors. We use deep reveals around windows to make them look bigger and to bounce light into the space. We use 9-foot ceilings for drywall efficiency and ceiling fans to help cross-ventilation. Max, this is Max. Max is a modified dog trot, permeating the outdoor social space. The plan is clearly divided into day and night. Kitchens become entry nexus and dog trot. Joanne's proves the simple math that the same amount of wall it proves that the geometry of a square plan gives you the same. Let me read this again. Excuse me, I'm not used to reading this shit, so I want to stick within the time limit, right? And she's already pulling me off stage. Where the hell am I? Okay, Joanne's proves the simple math that for the same amount of wall, the geometry of a square plan, unless you take a circle one, which is really difficult, gains you more interior square footage over a rectangular footprint. It's an efficient plan with little circulation. We care about stuff like the position of the ugly American refrigerator, in this case bouncing light off its face into the kitchen. We're working on the 2-bedroom version and the associated questions of larger communal spaces and where to locate the bedrooms. In this case, we gang them together, but it makes the house wider and less easy to build. It's fun to watch how folks live in the houses. A breakfast bar seemed like a good idea for us liberal designers. It's a place to imagine sipping your gin and tonic. You can see it over here. The reality, of course, is very different. The great, ugly American sofa ends up sitting at the bar. As we've got into the project, particularly with the 2 and 3 bedrooms and the associated family expectations, we've started to identify resources. Not only the local labor or the local materials, but also the kinship networks that exist. These folks live with very, very little. And frankly, it's the only way they can survive. There's little or no evidence of homelessness, frankly. We have kinship and community that you city folks strive for. So we work very hard not to damage these fragile networks by seeing the 20Ks as replacement homes. In this example, Adela, who is wheelchair-bound, lives in a shack and could literally not get in or out of the house. We replaced it with an ADA-accessible slab-on-grade 2-bedroom. Her daughter, Michelle, her primary caregiver, lived in the crappy trailer that sits right behind it. We were able to replace Michelle's trailer by literally building right next to it and pull the trailer out when the house was finished. The goal being to keep the family together and leverage the existing water and waste connections. In Adela's house, we made the bathroom a tornado shelter, not only for wheelchair-bound Adela, but for the 12 members of the family that live on the property, who will all squeeze into the shelter in case of a real emergency. Moving forward, we're looking at shifting the monthly burn. In targeting the operating costs of the house, we're looking to reduce and shift them into the fixed known costs of the mortgage. We believe for every dollar we can save in operating costs, we can add $200 to the mortgage. So for example, in examining our wall assemblies, where we compared our current baseline of 2x6 studs, unfaced insulation, and OSB with other options, we looked at the monthly utility costs of the assembly, the upfront costs of that assembly, assess the minimum required saving, and then the savings over the life of the loan. And ultimately have come up with a revised choice that represents best value versus our baseline option, potentially saving $2 on the monthly burn and offering a potential extra $400 in the mortgage, and obviously indirectly raising the market value of the home by using higher quality materials. And of course, we can do this for all the assemblies. And we can do this for the same thing with the home insurance. If we build the house to fortified construction standards, we can save 20 to 50% off our monthly burn that can add a whopping $4,000 if we move that monthly saving into the mortgage. So finally, looking forward, to roll these houses out on a bigger scale, and as we develop partnerships and partners, some of whom are in the room today, we want to address the challenge of the financial, educational, and communication system for procuring the house. Of course, this is a huge design challenge. Whether it's a need to establish community college training programs to educate folks to build these homes, or whether it's the fact that the bank says to us, hey, it costs the same to write a mortgage for $20,000 as it does to write a mortgage for $200,000, or whether it addresses the fact that builders bid solely on what it cost last time, or that today, of course, we as architects give out instruction sets and not construction sets. The challenges, as you know, are many. But for us, most importantly, it's a design challenge to make the process accessible to the folks that really need the houses and need to build them. Thank you, I'll shut up.
Okay, excellent start to the day. So this is how today's going to work. We're going to, rather than go straight to questions, we're going to ask you all to have conversation yourself. So we're going to do about 10 minutes. So circle around, folks in the folks up in the bleachers. You know, figure out how to have that conversation. I think, Chris, we have a question first. We're going to poll a question. Okay, so. Our question is, where is design energy most needed? And let's see, our choices are pre-development design and planning, financing products, parking, labor specifications, construction technology, and other. And of course, we can't wait to hear what your choices in other are. Is this going to come up for us immediately? Yes. Whoop. Well, I guess we fundamentally decided that parking's off the table. We will never build another parking space again. We just solved that today. Chris, David, we're done. Okay, so I'm gonna leave you there. We're gonna take a 10-minute break, and we're gonna come back with questions. Thank you. Okay, folks, we're gonna come back together. So far, I would say, to the Joint Center team, bravo, success. You got an incredible conversation going. And I want to really just say bravo to the three panelists. Incredible presentations. I think I want to just sort of ask the first question. I mean, number one, I think I personally am feeling incredibly optimistic. Like, wow, okay, maybe we can do this thing. So I want to ask the first question, really, two parts. One is, what part of this equation have you not solved? And then insofar as from a sort of design and construction perspective, perhaps you have created some really excellent solutions. Then what do you need from our colleagues from the policy and finance sector to be able to amplify your efforts?
Who's going
big
first
one.
here? That was, by the way, that was too many questions all at once.
Okay, what have you not solved? What's your next question, Michael?
Okay, so we have not solved the exact place to put the dish rack on the counter in the kitchen. It actually is, it's truly a dilemma in a small space. So one of the things that we have not solved is how to get around or collaborate with labor in our market, where we're going to be building using off-site modular technology. It's something that I don't think exists everywhere in the country, but in the Bay Area, labor is having a problem with off-site construction. And that's something that I think is going to take time to get through. But we, of course, as a small private development company, have not solved that yet.
So one thing I can say is we haven't solved Boston. I think we're in month 27 of a modest project we're trying to get approvals here in the Boston metropolitan region. And in that time, I think we've built 9 buildings in Philadelphia. So one of the questions that we always have is, I think we have come to learn the opportunities and frankly the downsides to easy approvals and sort of streamlining the process, which means that you have to take the good with the bad, meaning if you're allowing a lot to happen quickly, things aren't as tightly controlled. But I think we haven't solved this idea about how do you achieve some of the nimbleness and speed in certain markets and more sort of high pressure markets. And I think our belief is like unlocking development to I think that like anything, the more people that are involved at different scales, it's not just all big projects, there's big projects, there's small projects, there's adaptive reuse, there's marginal sites, there's sort of city center sites. Doing that's, I think, very, very challenging.
Want to take this one, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I think I tried to suggest it in the last slide. I mean, it's the whole kind of rollout package, from financing to communication to who's going to build it. I mean, it's a kind of complicated DNA. It's a complicated network, and there's questions all along the line. You talk to the banker, and he said, of course, I'd much prefer to write the $200,000 mortgage than a $20,000 mortgage. Or, I mean, we've had a series of beta testing rollouts of this sort of informally, and I think for us, we did the kind of standard architectural set of drawings, and what ended up happening was that it's interesting. The builder, as you all know, the builder does just compare it to, the last thing that he built, and so he picks the number out of the air, and it ended up being 5 times what we had expected. But also, the guy didn't look at the drawings, didn't use the drawings at all, and ended up building homes that were built to look like 20K homes, right? And so, obviously, the kind of communication package, either for the builder, the contractor, the community groups, the students in the community colleges that we'd like to get access to this, we need to give them some other communication package that is not the typical set of documents that architects give them today, because they're all about confusion, and they're all, you end up comparing apples to oranges every time. So we can give people a precise list of the amount of material. The problem was that in the cases that we've built homes, the general contractor is not in charge of buying the materials. The sub bought the materials, so the sub won't tell the GC how much he spent on materials to pad his, So, yeah, it's just complicated. It's a kind of wonderful mess, but it is, we consider it a design challenge.
So one of you mentioned that your work is a little bit more like being an industrial designer, and. I know I read in the news that last week in Austin, I believe a house was 3D printed for $4,000. Meanwhile, the balloon framing was invented in the 1820s. And yet, somehow, it continues to seem to be an incredibly viable construction technology. Let's talk about, lots of interest in containers, interest in modular, different kinds of modular. Interest in different construction techniques. How much do you think that kind of investigation is important in your markets?
Yeah, I would say it is amongst the most critical of components to the whole development business right now is the advancement of construction technology. And I think the next panel is going to talk a lot about that, but we are a customer of good construction technology, which, as you mentioned, has not changed a ton since balloon framing in the early 1800s. We've used wood modular in the past. We are currently shipping a 22-unit apartment building to a site that we own in Berkeley right now. That is going to be steel modular. But it really, the construction technology has not changed enough. Offsite is tremendously helpful to us because of the height of labor requirements in the Bay Area. It is so expensive to build, and there are too few skilled laborers in the Bay Area to actually build the buildings that we need to have built. So we're looking to offsite methodology, and I think, Andrew, that's why this is, for us, really exciting that you're doing innovative stuff on a small scale, but for a very, very little amount of money. So I think if we could squish together what you're doing and what we're doing, that would be a good start.
I mean, we've done prefab in Philadelphia, and one of the things that's interesting, I think one of the things that's really fascinating is the local information for projects related to labor and cost and design. I mean, one of the things that we found is like a prefab challenge is there's still a site contractor that takes a lot of responsibility for construction, but they're getting a very small piece of the building, say 20% of the build, foundation, coordination, some of the utility tie-ins, and then an out-of-town fabrication company is bringing in 80% of the building. And that can be the contractual relationship between those people can be very thorny. And I think those issues are as important as any construction technology one, meaning that how do those people get along on site? And frankly, how do the contract philosophy we've been under for decades need to change to share liability in new ways and to focus more on the results of the project rather on each person's sort of position within the contract.
Yeah, I will say in the Bay Area, the percentage of spend for us on the on-site is about 60%, whereas the modular component is about 40%. So it really obviously depends on the location, but I would imagine in your neighborhoods, there may even be more resistant to modular, because if the site guy only gets 10% of the spend, it's going to be tough.
Right. I mean, even at 60%, there's a big chunk of the building that's going to a sub that almost has their own agency in the process. And but it's part of the challenge. I think we've seen like general contractors that can provide prefab as under their umbrella seems to be like an organization that works really well.
I would love to be able to print a home in Newbern, but on the current, with my current internet being 1100, I'm screwed. So I also live in the middle of a forest, so why not build the houses out of wood? And of course, we're starting to look at CLT construction and a sort of a pickup truck version of CLT construction. But I think
Do you want to say what that is?
Cross-laminated timber is where you're literally almost building solid walls of wood. Solid walls of wood that are built in layers, right? Honestly, in our situation, we need jobs. So if you can come up with any other ways of construction that, we'd be delighted to prefabricate it. Our fear is that the prefabrication will end up in one plant in South Carolina, which is what we've got already, and that doesn't do any good to our local economy. So if you can come up with something that local folks in our community can do that will allow them to stay in that community, because it's a myth that people all want to come to the city. They're actually kind of happy there. They just like some decent work that's not shitty service sector work. They'd like to be creative, and they'd like to be productive, and they'd like to build homes. But so that's why we go back to the stick frame building. So we absolutely would love to prefabricate more of it, but it is kind of, how do you keep that wealth locally?
So we're going to go to some questions from the audience. Those of you who are on Twitter, and we've gotten a lot of comments. If you have questions as well that you want answered, please submit them via Twitter, and we'll let them roll, and someone will pick it up and pass it on. So can I take some questions from your tables? Yes, please.
How much of the savings in modular is technology versus the cost of labor being just a lot? They're charging, you know, the hourly rate is $15 an hour versus $30 an hour or higher.
Sure. From our perspective, we are the first building that we built on Harriet Street, which was 23 apartments. We constructed it in Sacramento and drove it down. We didn't actually save any money on the hard costs. It was more or less an R&D project for us to figure out, can we build modular in an urban environment? So we saved zero on that. On our second one, which is in the works today, it's likely that we're going to save about 10% on hard costs, which is not a ton of money. What does help us save, though, is the 8 months of construction time. We're going to be collecting, I think, about $45,000 a month in rental income on that building. Multiply that by 8 months, that's a lot of money. And so putting that into the equation is a big saver. And we are the biggest cheerleaders for modular housing right now because of that fact.
Yeah. We built a 72-unit, 70,000 square foot wood frame modular project in Philadelphia in 9 months. It actually may have cost a little more than if it was done another way, but the time savings is remarkable, especially in an urban environment where just controlling site and closing streets and having to stage costs money. Being able to be in and out like that is, I think, really, I think that's where the urban sort of economic advantages are.
One of the conversations we had over our break when we were talking was the really wonderful thing to see these three very different economies, different environments, these different cities, and how tailored the design approaches were to the needs of that community. And yet it seems as if we're operating in a national context with national standards that are not necessarily specific. And I thought the slide was very interesting, Brian, about, of course, the politics and the approvals processes. How do you see how some of these national standards sort of relate in the local context, whether it's the way buildings are financed or the way they're approved, or love to hear a little bit of that and hear from those ideas later in the afternoon as well.
I mean, one thing I'll say is the two projects I showed, the one against the railroad and the 11-foot wide building in Chinatown in Philadelphia, were both receiving variances on the building code that the city was giving for travel distance for the furthest unit from the single stair, which has since been, they're no longer giving the variance. The lesson there is those buildings can't be built now. And I think there was an economy of scale in the number of units you could generate per cost, right? Because buildings at some level cost money because there's cores and there's like supporting space rather than rentable area. And these buildings actually had a remarkable amount of rentable area, which I think goes to this idea of affordability. So in a city of 16-foot wide lots, using the same building code standards as a city with 20 or 30-foot lots or very different kinds of patterns, there are things that can be unlocked in subtleties of the code that might allow for affordability. So I think this issue that there's local, and there's a lot of local jurisdictions that have, exceptions to the code, but I think there's not many that are like strategically given to unlock value. I think they're the whim of the fire marshal, or someone had an experience with something and they have a personal stake in thinking about those regulations in a certain way. But to think about it as a local way of seeing the way we make buildings, I think is interesting.
I think parking is is one of the big boogeymen.
Who agrees? I mean, right.
And I will say it is, the idea of cars and parking is changing quite a bit. I mean, Andrew, when you talk about, when I look at what you're building, there's, of course, plenty available parking space on the outside of the homes. Mm-hmm. It costs us 3 times the amount to build 1 parking space that it does for you to build that home.
Right.
So I think that the whole perception around parking it's changing, but we do hope it changes quicker. The building that I mentioned in Oakland, we are entitling for over 1,000 apartments, and we are very hopeful that we will get 0 parking spaces. It's 1 block from the Bay Area's busiest transit station called BART. So the idea of, I think for a lot of people, of having no parking spaces for 1,000 units is bonkers. But in certain places like Oakland and in San Francisco and Berkeley and potentially parts of Philadelphia, it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah.
Do you have bike parking, Michael?
We do. We're going to have tons of bike parking. In fact, it's called Bike East Bay, is super psyched on this project because of all the bike parking spaces we're going to have.
Two thoughts about that. I agree. I mean, one thing I'll say is Philadelphia's zoning code, the most onerous parking ratio is 3 spaces for 10 units, which is kind of remarkable as an as-of-right ratio. But an interesting aside, we were funded by the Knight Foundation a few years ago to think about what a 100K house would be in Miami. And we were getting all excited about the design and the climate and how to save money. And we realized they had a 2-to-1 ratio for parking. And we met with planning, and we were like, you can't build these projects. You can't do small incremental infill. But developers in Miami were like, I think we can sell and rent these houses without parking, which was interesting that like development had advanced beyond planning. And because we came to planning as a research entity and not a developer, they actually piloted small-scale infill without parking, and you're starting to see these smaller projects, and you're starting to see a different reaction. So I think that's absolutely the case.
Do we have one more question? Yes, please.
So, Michael, are you building market rate affordable, or are you building affordable using subsidies, tax credits? What's the economic model that you're working?
We are building market rate housing that is affordable by design. With that said, we are also building income-restricted affordable housing. What we're building in Oakland, we're going to have 84 units, which are going to be income restricted to people making 50% or less than the area median income.
All without any subsidy?
All without 0 subsidies.
Yes, please.
I guess
Yeah.
all with 0 subsidies. Without.
Go ahead.
Andrew mentioned, is this on? Andrew mentioned the ugly American fridge and the big couch, and Brian mentioned the stairwells and the bathrooms. I was wondering, how have your designs changed by actually having done this for a while and seeing how people are using your spaces? And how is that, have any of these changes made things more expensive, or how have you kind of balanced, the need to change, or have you changed?
Well, we in the 4-hour version of the lecture, we're often kind of put in the same slot as the tiny house movement, and sort of relative to the last discussion, we're culturally not trying to change the way that folks live. We live in a place that, people are land rich and cash poor. There's space, and so when we do a 1-bedroom, it is about 500 square feet, but it does have to acknowledge the furniture you can get at Rent-A-Center. Which is not typically Mies van der Rohe, right? And it doesn't expect you to sit on, and cook on top of your bed. So culturally, we're very aware of all of that. Specific examples, I don't know.
Do you furnish the apartments, Michael? It looked like
Yes,
there's
ours
some
are
built-ins.
100% furnished.
Yeah.
With a small space, if someone does bring in a gigundous sofa, it's not going to work, so we furnish everything.
Make the doors smaller.
Right.
Okay, well, I'd love to really give a huge round of applause to our panelists. Thank you. Really great start to the day. Thank you.